Somewhere in the New Testament, buried inside one of the shortest books ever written, there is a verse that has no business being there. It appears without warning, without context, without explanation. And it describes a scene so strange, so cosmically violent, so theologically loaded, that most pastors skip over it in seconds. The archangel Michael stands over the dead body of Moses. Satan is there too, and they are fighting over the corpse. One verse, no backstory, no resolution, no explanation of what happened next. The Epistle of Jude, chapter 1, verse 9. Michael the archangel, when contending with the devil and disputing about the body of Moses, dared not bring a railing accusation against him, but said, "The Lord rebuke you." Read that again slowly. The commander of heaven's armies, the being who stands closest to the throne of God, the archangel who, in the book of Daniel, is called the great prince who stands guard over God's people. This being refuses to rebuke Satan with his own authority. He defers, he steps back, he invokes God's name instead of his own power. Why? And more importantly, why does Satan want the body of Moses in the first place? The Bible gives you the scene, it gives you the combatants, it gives you the outcome. But it never tells you why any of it happened. That answer exists. It has always existed. It was preserved in text the church decided you didn't need to read, in traditions that were quietly buried, in manuscripts that survived centuries of suppression. And it is far more disturbing than anything the single verse in Jude suggests. If this is your first time on this channel, you came to the right place. Every video on this channel goes somewhere the mainstream version of the Bible doesn't want to go. Subscribe now. Hit the bell. Because what we're about to uncover is not a side note. It is one of the most theologically explosive confrontations in all of Scripture, and almost no one is talking about it. Before we go deeper, we need to establish what the official record actually tells us and where it goes completely silent. Moses dies on Mount Nebo. Deuteronomy 34 is precise about this. God shows him the full expanse of the promised land from the peak of the mountain, the land he will never enter, and Moses dies there at the age of 120 years. His eye was not dim, his natural force had not faded. And then Deuteronomy says something remarkable. God buries him, not the Israelites, not Joshua, not the priests. God himself buries Moses in a valley in Moab. And then the text adds a detail that sounds like a deliberate warning. No one knows his burial place to this day. No tomb, no marked grave, no location. In a culture where burial sites were sacred, where the graves of the patriarchs were known and venerated, where Joseph's bones were carried out of Egypt across 40 years of wilderness, Moses gets an unmarked grave that no one can find, buried by a hand no human witnessed. The official record calls this an honor, God himself performing the burial. But there is a question the text never answers. Why did Moses need to be hidden? Think about what this means in historical context. The Israelites venerated their dead. Abraham's tomb at Machpelah was a known site. Rachel's grave was marked. The bones of the patriarchs were tracked across generations. The location of a burial was not a minor administrative detail. It was theology made physical. A grave was a statement about who that person was and who they belonged to. So why does the most important grave in Israelite history, the grave of the man who mediated the covenant, who received the law, who stood inside the cloud on Sinai, why does that grave have no address? If this were simply a dignified burial, why does the text go out of its way to tell us that no one knows where he is? Why does the location have to be secret? Why does the most important figure in the entire Hebrew Bible, the man who spoke with God face to face, get an unmarked grave in enemy territory? The official text doesn't answer, but Jude's single verse suggests something else was happening on that mountain, something that required an archangel to intervene. we call the first witness. The source is not a fringe text. It is not the work of a cult or a heretical sect. It is a document that was read aloud in early Christian communities, quoted by multiple church fathers, and treated as authoritative. Scripture in the Ethiopian Orthodox Bible, one of the oldest continuous Christian traditions on earth. The Book of Enoch. Specifically, the sections dealing with the Watchers and their relationship to death, burial, and the corruption of the physical world. In Enoch's cosmology, the earth itself is contested territory. When a being of significant spiritual power dies, whether human or otherwise, the location of that death and burial carries a kind of spiritual weight. Sacred sites become anchors. They become points of intersection between the visible and the invisible. Enoch describes in extraordinary detail how fallen spiritual beings, the Watchers, seek to establish control over these intersection points. They are drawn to places where the boundary between worlds has been made thin by an act of power. And Moses was not merely a man. Moses had stood inside the cloud on Sinai. Moses had seen the back of God. Moses had parted waters, called down plagues, carried the presence of God in his face so intensely that the Israelites could not look at him directly without a veil. In Enochian terms, Moses' body was not just a corpse, it was a sight. Consider what that means. Every miracle Moses performed left a mark on the physical world: the parted sea, the water from the rock, the pillar of fire. If the location of miraculous events carries spiritual significance, then the body of the man through whom those events flowed carries something even more concentrated. Moses was not a passive instrument. He was a conduit, a human being who had been touched by the divine so repeatedly, so intensely, that the boundary between his physical existence and the spiritual world had become unusually thin. That thinness does not disappear at death. If anything, at death, when the soul departs and the body remains, that sight becomes vulnerable in ways it never was during life. And if that sight could be located, identified, and claimed, it could become something else entirely. That is why God hid the grave, not out of sentiment, out of strategy. But Enoch only tells part of the story, because Enoch explains why the body mattered cosmically. It does not explain why Satan personally came to claim it. For that, we need a second witness. A text so specific, so detailed in its account of the death of Moses that Jude almost certainly drew directly from it, or from the tradition it preserves. The Assumption of Moses, also called the Testament of Moses. A Jewish text composed sometime between the 1st century before Christ and the 1st century after, preserving traditions that are almost certainly far older than the manuscript itself. The full text no longer exists. Fragments survive in Latin, translated from a Greek original, translated from an original Aramaic or Hebrew source. What survives is enough. The Assumption of Moses describes a cosmic legal dispute, not a physical battle, a legal one, and this changes everything about how we read Jude's verse. In the Assumption, Satan does not come to steal Moses' body through force. He comes to make a claim, a legal claim. His argument, preserved in fragmentary form and reconstructed through patristic sources, including Origen and Clement of Alexandria, who clearly had access to versions of this text that are now lost, is this: Moses killed an Egyptian. Exodus 2 records it plainly. Before Moses knew who he was, before the burning bush, before any commission from God, Moses saw an Egyptian beating a Hebrew slave. He looked around to make sure no one was watching, and he killed the man and buried him in the sand. Satan's argument before the divine council was that Moses, by this act, had brought himself under his jurisdiction, the domain of death, the claim of the accuser. Moses was a murderer, and the murderer's body, Satan argued, belonged to him. Now pause and feel the weight of that argument, because Satan is not fabricating a charge. He is not inventing a sin. He is going into the actual record, the same record preserved in the canonical text of Exodus, and surfacing a real event, a real death, a real act of concealment. Moses looked around to make sure no one was watching before he struck. But God was watching, and so was the accuser. This is why Michael does not simply destroy Satan where he stands, because Satan is not wrong about the facts. The killing happened, the concealment happened, and in the architecture of divine law, as these texts describe it, the accuser has standing to make that claim. Michael's response is not to dispute the facts. He says, "The Lord rebuke you." He appeals to a higher authority, not because he lacks the power to crush Satan, but because the dispute is legal, and legal disputes require legal answers. Michael is not weak. Michael is precise. He's saying, "This case is above my jurisdiction. It belongs to the judge. We call the third witness, and this one comes from a direction no one expects." Jewish mystical tradition, specifically the rabbinic literature preserved in texts like the Midrash and the Talmud, contains a body of material about the death of Moses that is shockingly detailed. Material that reads less like theology and more like eyewitness testimony to something that actually happened. In several Midrashic sources, the death of Moses is described not as a peaceful passing, but as a negotiated event. God himself must argue with the angel of death, a figure that in later Jewish tradition becomes increasingly associated with the adversary, with the accuser, with Satan. In one version, the angel of death is sent to collect Moses' soul and cannot do it. Moses simply refuses. He argues. He invokes every act of righteousness in his life. The angel of death retreats. God sends the angel again. Again, Moses refuses. Finally, in one of the most extraordinary passages in all of rabbinic literature, God himself takes the soul of Moses with a kiss. Not because Moses has been defeated, but because this is the only way Moses would consent to die. The intimacy of it, the direct act of God, bypassing every intermediary, every angelic messenger. Why would that be necessary? Because Moses knew. Moses knew what was waiting on the other side of death. He had seen enough of the invisible world, standing inside the cloud on Sinai, to understand that death for him would not be simple. There is something else hidden inside this rabbinic account that most readers miss entirely. Moses does not resist death out of fear. He resists because he understands the stakes. Every time the angel of death retreats, Moses is not simply buying time. He is making a theological argument. He is saying, "My death cannot be administered through ordinary channels. The ordinary channels are compromised. The accuser has infiltrated them. If my soul passes through the standard mechanism of death, the legal dispute waiting on the other side will be initiated before I can be protected." God's response, taking the soul directly, personally, through an act of divine intimacy, is not just a tender farewell to his most faithful servant. It is a legal maneuver. It bypasses the system that the accuser controls. It removes Moses from the jurisdiction of the ordinary death mechanism and places him directly in the custody of the one who sits above every court. The Midrash does not use the word Satan in these passages, but the adversarial force that must be circumvented, outmaneuvered, bypassed through a direct act of divine intimacy, that force is the same entity Jude names. And what these rabbinic sources add, what they contribute that no other witness provides, is this. The dispute over Moses was anticipated. God planned around it. The hidden grave was not improvised. It was part of the architecture of protection. God buried Moses in secret because he knew that if the location were known, the battle Jude describes in a single verse would have become something far larger. The grave was hidden. The soul was taken directly. And still, Satan came. We call the fourth witness the New Testament itself. Not Jude, but the text that, if you know what you're looking for, shows you that Moses' story did not end on Mount Nebo. The Transfiguration, Matthew 17, Mark 9, Luke 9. Jesus takes Peter, James, and John to the top of a high mountain, and there, before their eyes, he is transfigured. His face shines like the sun, his garments become white as light. And two figures appear beside him, Moses and Elijah, not visions, not symbols, not metaphors. The text presents them as present, speaking, engaged in conversation with Jesus about what is about to happen in Jerusalem. Elijah's presence makes a certain kind of sense in the logic of the Hebrew Bible. He never died. The chariot of fire, the whirlwind. He was taken. He was preserved. He is available. But Moses died. Moses was buried in an unmarked grave by God himself. Moses was the subject of a cosmic legal battle over his body. Moses, and by every account, should not be standing on a mountaintop in Galilee speaking with the Son of God, unless he is no longer simply dead. Luke's account adds one detail the other Gospels leave out. He tells us what Moses and Elijah were actually talking about with Jesus. They were discussing his departure, the Greek word is Exodus, which he was about to accomplish in Jerusalem. The word is not accidental. Moses, the man of the first Exodus, stands with the one who will accomplish the final one, the man whose death was disputed, whose body was contested, whose soul was taken by God personally to keep it out of the accuser's hands. This man stands in light on a mountain, speaking about a death that will settle every legal claim the accuser has ever brought against anyone. The Transfiguration has been read for centuries as a confirmation of Jesus' divine nature, and it is. But it is simultaneously the resolution of a thread that began on Mount Nebo. Moses appears at the Transfiguration as a being who has passed through death and come out the other side. The dispute that Satan brought, the legal claim over the murderer's body, was answered, not overturned on a technicality. Answered at the root. The same way every claim of the accuser is ultimately answered in this theological framework, not by denying the debt, but by paying it. Moses, the murderer. Moses, who struck the rock in anger. Moses, who was forbidden from entering the promised land because of his failures. This Moses appears at the Transfiguration, standing in glory. And if you trace the line from Deuteronomy 34 to Jude 9 to Matthew 17, what you have is not three separate stories. You have one story. Now we name the pattern. Because every witness we have called, Enoch, the Assumption of Moses, the rabbinic tradition, the Transfiguration, every single one points to the same structure. The body of Moses was not incidental. It was the battlefield. Satan's claim was legal, not physical. He was not trying to reanimate a corpse. He was trying to establish jurisdiction, to plant a flag on the most spiritually significant burial site in Israelite history. A grave that, if known and claimed, could have been used as a point of corruption. A false shrine. A site of intercession that bypassed the living God and ran through the accuser instead. And here is what makes this more disturbing than it first appears. If Satan was willing to make that claim over Moses, if he came personally, not through a subordinate, not through a lesser spirit, but came himself to stand over that grave and argue his case, what does that tell you about the stakes? Satan does not waste effort. The accuser does not bring cases he has no chance of winning. He came to Mount Nebo because he believed his claim was valid, because the legal architecture of the universe, as these texts describe it, gave him genuine standing to make that argument. God's response was not to simply destroy Satan's claim with raw power. God's response was architectural. He buried Moses in secret. He sent Michael, not to destroy Satan, but to hold the line legally, to invoke the higher authority, to refuse to allow the dispute to be settled on Satan's terms. He took Moses' soul directly, bypassing death's normal mechanisms. He left no grave anyone could find. And then, at the moment that would define all of history, the moment of the Transfiguration, where Jesus stands revealed as the one who absorbs and overcomes every legitimate claim the accuser could ever make, Moses stands there, vindicated, present, free. This is what Jude's one verse contains, not a curiosity, not a footnote. A compressed theological argument about the nature of death, the structure of divine justice, and the impossibility of any claim, however technically accurate, surviving contact with the one who holds the final word. Michael said, "The Lord rebuke you," and the Lord did. He rebuked Satan's claim not with an argument, but with a resurrection. Here's what this changes about everything you thought you knew. We read the Bible as a document of human history. God does things. People respond. Prophets speak. Nations rise and fall. And we place all of it on a horizontal timeline, event following event following event. But these texts, Enoch, the Assumption of Moses, the rabbinic literature, the Transfiguration account, they describe a second timeline running parallel to the visible one. Every death is contested. Every burial site is a claim. Every soul that passes from this world into the next enters a space where jurisdiction matters, where the question of who holds the legal right to that soul is not a metaphor, but a mechanism. Satan is not a cartoon villain in this framework. He is a prosecuting attorney with a legitimate caseload. He finds the real charges. He brings the actual debts. He does not invent accusations. He surfaces them. Moses killed a man. That is true. Moses concealed it. That is true. Satan brought it before the divine court. And Michael, rather than dismissing the claim with force, deferred to the judge, because that is how the system works. And that system is still running. Every time the New Testament refers to Jesus as our advocate, our intercessor, the one who ever lives to make intercession, it is describing a legal function, a response to an accuser who still has standing, who still brings cases, who still appears before the throne. The book of Revelation calls him the accuser of the brethren, the one who accuses them before God day and night. Day and night. Not occasionally, not historically, continuously. The courtroom is always in session, the accuser is always present, and the advocate is always there to answer. The dispute over Moses' body was not a one-time event. It was a preview, a model of the cosmic machinery that operates beneath every human life. You are not just a person moving through time. You are a case file. And whether you take that literally or theologically, or simply as the most serious possible metaphor for the weight of human moral choices, the architecture is the same. The accuser finds the real charges. The advocate stands in the gap, and the judge speaks the final word. That word in Moses' case was spoken on a mountain in Galilee, where a murderer, a man who struck the rock, a man who was told he would not enter the promised land, stood in light, speaking with the one who was about to walk into Jerusalem and absorb every legitimate claim the accuser had ever brought against anyone. That is the theology hidden inside Jude's one verse, not a ghost story, not a curiosity, not a footnote for Bible trivia enthusiasts. A map of the invisible legal structure that governs the relationship between human failure, divine justice, and the one who stands between them. Moses made it through, not because his record was clean. His record was not clean. He made it through because the one who holds final jurisdiction spoke. And when that voice speaks, no other claim survives. Jude gives you one verse that opens into a universe. If this video gave you something you did not have before, if it changed how you read that single line in Jude, or how you see the death of Moses, or how you understand what is happening beneath the surface of the text, please leave a like. It costs you nothing, but it tells the algorithm that this kind of content deserves to reach people who are ready for it. Subscribe to this channel. Every video goes somewhere the standard sermon does not. We pull on the threads the official version leaves dangling, and we follow them wherever they lead, no matter how far down they go. The deeper you go, the stranger and more coherent it all becomes.